Make sure everybody can hear. Hopefully you can hear at the board level. We're going to go ahead and get started with our work session today. As you know, we are continuing our discussion related to the superintendent's proposed budget. What we're really trying to do today is to continue to do our work as a board to drill down towards an additional draft. Of course, we have a public hearing this evening, so we're going to continue to receive public input both on the superintendent's proposed draft, and then next week, as we have additional changes, if any, coming forward, we also have an opportunity for the public to comment on that as we move towards adopting a budget. What we'll do today is going to give each school board member just an opportunity to kind of have the floor to themselves to share thoughts, comments, concerns, questions that they may have. If there's some recommendations that any individual board member would like for the full board to consider in terms of our ability to share back with Dr. Boone and her team what the will of the board is, or majority of board thought is on some areas on the budget. That's what we're trying to achieve. So we'll do that for the next hour, 15 minutes or so. Then we'll take a brief break, and we'll give Dr. Boone and her team an opportunity to respond to what they've heard us come up with or discuss, and then any type of additional question and answer that either we may have of the administration may have of the board based upon our work is what we'll do. So I am going to give Dr. Boone an opportunity for just any opening comments she would like to give to us in regards to what she presented to us last week and where things may stand this week as we have this conversation.
Good afternoon, Mr. Jordan, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen. The only opening comments that I want to make are relative to what we know about the state's budget. Many of you, or all of you, are probably aware that the General Assembly session concluded without the adoption of a budget. As such, that means that many of the budget bills and amendments and everything technically sunset with the closing of the session. The governor has called, the governor will send down a new budget bill, and we don't have any idea as to whether or not he will offer amendments to the budget that was before the General Assembly prior to adjournment or not. The governor has called a special General Assembly session for April 11th to address the state budget. Obviously, we anticipate activity between the budget committees, the governor's office, and all of that in this interim period between now and April 11th. So as we presented the budget last week, we shared that our assumptions were based on the governor's proposed budget. And so without a state budget, we don't have any updates to the state revenue portion of the budget. So we'll continue to work from the original governor's proposed budget that we have before us. So that was the update I wanted to provide.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Boone. So we're going to go ahead and go forward for our discussion. Going to start with Dr. Robison, our senior member of the board. And so Dr. Robison, the floor is yours, and you have an initial up to 10 minutes if that's what it takes for you to go through whatever items you like to discuss.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Dr. Boone, I think overall the budget is a good budget under the circumstances, and where you're positioning the dollars, the resources. There are a few things that I would like to see included in this budget and or future budgets if at all possible. And starting off with increasing climate and safety, I would like to see in-school suspensions extended to all the schools. I know you're trying to increase that this year, but I would like to see it in all schools, simply for the fact that the number one reason why families that, for lack of a better word, have choices to make, choose not to go to Norfolk Public Schools is not because of the educational opportunities or lack of, it's because of climate and safety, and I think that's a big issue in that. For retaining strong academic families, I'd like to see an increase in professional development to improve our customer service. Overall, I see it's improved over the time I've been on the board, but I don't think it's drilled down deep enough to really to have enough buy-in to be effective. The more I talk to people that try to interact with either the central office or individual schools, still have problems dealing with certain individuals in certain schools, and it's just, we need to change that. We need to start looking at our families as customers and treat them as such. I know we plan to do that, but I think we need to be more intentional for that. And that's why I've always advocated for the Disney model, and I know several school divisions around the country at our trainings at the NSBA have brought that to bear, and I would like to see us do that. I would also like us to consider an audit of special education. I've been party to a number of families that have issues with that, and until we get that under control, I think we really need to do an audit similar to what we did with the alternative ed program. Promoting NPS as an outstanding accomplishments, I would like us to commission an economic impact study, something that we brought up several years ago through changes in transition in leadership that kind of fell by the wayside. But I think we need to start looking at that. Where we are right now, we know that we have one of the largest employee workforces in the city, but how that affects economically from an outside source. We had Dr. Cook from ODU that was willing to do that for a very nominal fee back in the day, about $10,000. So I think it's something that behooves us to do that, not just where we are currently, but where we are aspirationally as we move forward. And as the board's fiduciary responsibilities, we need to push forward the capital improvement plan, the ed planning study, to find out where we can start containing some costs. We're asking the city to make more money. We need to continue to show that we're spending our money wisely. One example is a district-wide pharmacy. It's been reported that Chesapeake had substantial cost savings. We know in the healthcare industry, in fact, there was an article in today's paper concerning one of the causes of the astronomical advances in healthcare costs is the cost of pharmaceuticals. And if we can get that under control with a district-wide pharmacy, possibly even a clinic that would be a district-wide clinic, that would be way out of the box thinking for Norfolk Public Schools, but I think it's something that we should look forward and think in the future for that. So that's all I've got to say about that, sir.
So just a question for you, because you mentioned there may be some things you would like for us to consider including in the budget today or future budgets. Of these items that you've mentioned, is there anything that you would like for us to consider recommending to Dr. Boone for this current budget?
The first two especially.
The
in-school suspensions for all and increased professional development. Followed very closely by the audit of the special education program.
Well, one of the things I guess we can do is, once we finish all of this, is come back, and I'm sure a question would be in terms of the in-school suspension extension to all, what that would cost. But of these three items that Dr. Robison has brought forward, in-school suspension monitors, I guess it is, extension to all students, all schools, increase in PD with customer service, which may or may not be I don't know if there's a financial thing or administrative thing, and then also setting funds aside for special education audit. Any objection to any of those? That might be the easiest thing to just a note for now. So everyone, Ms. Basine?
Are we, well, not an,
I am. I'm asking on my question, yes.
yeah, well, not an objection. Are we asking, so about the in-school suspension monitors, about how many do we have left to fulfill? Can you remind us?
Yeah, so we're going to come back. That's why I was just trying to get a sense
Right.
of where the board was in terms of even kind of moving
Okay.
forward towards that
Okay.
when we get to Dr. Boone and the Q&A piece.
This is kind of a new thing for us.
Yeah, no, we're trying it out.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
have to fumble through a little
Yeah.
bit. It's quite all right.
Yeah.
I was not, I was kind of taken aback that I'd have to lead off, but,
you know, I wanted to make seniority has its privileges, and oftentimes, you know, we get into the debate and everybody doesn't feel like they get a full chance. I just want to make sure everybody a full chance.
And
So,
I appreciate that.
The audience is asking to make sure everybody speaks into the mic so we can hear each other. It's a large open space.
yeah, we'll do the best we can speaking to the microphones, but, you know, we want the public to hear, but we also need to be able to look at each other when we do our work, so we'll do the best we can. So I'm just going to leave that there for now with Dr. Robison, and next we have Dr. Gabriel.
Well, this is I believe it's my 6th budget cycle, and I still feel like there's a lot left for me to learn. Processing the budget, time frame, what to ask for, when to ask for it. But where I see us in the process right now as a board is blending the recommendations that Dr. Boone and team have recommended, which I feel strongly in support of all of the recommendations that you all have put forth, but blending in those desires with the desires that we bring as your board members. And some of the items that I put forth in email are just items to consider, maybe not necessarily items that would have a specific line item in the budget, but just how can we better explain how we are allocating funds in order to do the events that are suggested. And so what I will say as far as my request for the budget is, number one, I'm appreciative for what has come forth so far. Substitute pay, bus driver pay, classified staff, the compensation study, all of those items I support. The areas that I would say to give an additional attention to under academics would be in the area of our middle schools. We have 4 of 6 middle schools that are not yet accredited. And middle schools over the many years have had some struggle with staffing, with students, and I believe that there needs to be some attention, intentional attention given to what is needed in order to accelerate the progress that we are making in our schools, because you can look at our scores and you can look at other data points and see that we are making progress. But what can we do to accelerate that progress? And as a board member, you know, I don't have those answers, but do the answers lie in smaller class sizes? Do they lie in funds for tutoring? Do they lie in Saturday school? Do they lie in extra specialists? So I would like for us to give added attention to our middle schools. And if that's already within the budget, or if we can demonstrate that in the budget, excellent. If not, then I say we put the ask for it while we're in this discussion. The other area of concern that I have under academics is that we have a growing English language learner population. And we have several staff members that are shared amongst the schools. My question to the team is, do we need more for the students that we will be receiving, or for the students that we have, in order to keep them on the track academically? Number 3, academics aren't the only thing that we like to educate our students on. We like to think of ourselves as a division that educates the whole student. And part of that is making sure that each child can equitably access music, art, and PE. Can we put forth in our budget teachers, programs that would allow every student to have access to music, art, and PE on top of what we already deliver? So if it's to decrease the amount of teachers that are shared in between buildings, can we advocate for that? Can we make it so that the same teacher is delivering art in that building each day of the week versus being shared between many schools, or a different art teacher every different day? I would ask that we would support that. Some of the other items that I would like to address is not necessarily my own item, but something that I have heard from the community, and that is along the lines of our operations. Whatever the Council of Great City Schools is suggesting in their review of the division, I would wholeheartedly support. But there is a growing concern about our buses, transportation, and whether or not we need some type of accounting system on our buses. GPS. Parents are concerned. They do want to know where their children are in this day and age with all of the safety concerns that are out there. I believe it's warranted. And I would ask the division, have we looked at what the cost would be for GPS on our buses, and perhaps the return on investment as far as climate, parental satisfaction, parental assuredness, maybe that might outweigh some of the costs that we may not be able to dollar-wise count. Am I more than 10 minutes? Yeah, I got time, okay. As far as technology goes, I would like to make sure that the technology that we currently have in our school buildings is running, functional, that we have replacement parts for it, and that we have staff members that are trained on how to use it. I'll leave it at that. I would like for us to be able to have one-to-one computers for our students, but that might be a plan that we work towards. With regards to building maintenance and capital improvement, I would also like to see a capital improvement plan, in addition to the report that we received on the schools and the facilities index. But what will that plan look like in addressing the great needs that we have for our buildings? I'm going to kind of touch on just a couple of different things. I do support the special education audit. I think that more can be done to close gaps and increase the potential and achievements for our special education students. I'm very supportive of keeping the grant writer in our budget, perhaps even making it a full-time position. We've been able to enact some great policies, the wellness policy and the suicide policy. If there's anything that we need financially in order to make these policies as effective as possible, I would ask the team to consider those in the budget, whether that's professional development or pay for teachers to come out and do extra training. Again, I'll reiterate 100% in support of the progress that we've made thus far for our CTE High School, the program aspect of it, whatever is needed to bring professionals in, to give professional development training, to enact the programs for the items that we want to bring forth to the students and have in collaboration with the community. I say we put it in the budget and we ask for everything that we need because we definitely know that the return on investment is going to be there. And that wraps it up, I guess.
Anyone have any questions or points of clarification for Dr. Gabriel? Yeah, just a couple of things on the middle school piece. Just one concern I have is, while I agree with you, I think we need to find ways of accelerating. I think that we have to be careful that we don't lump all the schools together in terms of where they are in terms of accreditation. So we know from the data reviews and some of the things we have, we know that there's some schools that are at, 1 point, other schools are at different points. So as the state has worked on their multiple accreditation rating, I think we've got to be able to tie our work back to that. The other thing is, I think with at the retreat, when we spent a lot of time getting an update on the MPS redesign, I kind of see that as the core work that's going on to try to improve some things. And so while I would agree with you if there are some specific things that are needed in order to move things forward, I just caution that we don't try to treat, like every time we get to budget season time, it's like we feel like we got to put everything in one budget at a time. But I support that, and I think we can find out later in the question and answer, but I think we have a English language coordinator, because I think we talked about that at the last retreat. But those are just some of the initial actions. Just one point of clarification, the one-to-one, are you referring to the bring your own device, or referring to making sure that that there's a device in the school that the school division provides for every child?
I'm not sure what would work best for Norfolk Public Schools if it works so that I would want for every child to have access to technology. And whether that is some kids bring their own device and we provide devices to others, but as long as every child has access to the same technology, I would be happy with that.
Anyone else? Questions or clarification? All right, so we'll probably come back a little bit later. Reverend Haywood, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan, Dr. Boone, my colleagues here on the board. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to the budget. Let me give a summary statement. I think that this is a good budget, and I fully support this budget. Let me give you the context for my positive reception. I believe that the division is trending positively in the areas of academics. I think that we're making some broad and steady progress. I fully expect that over the next year that progress will continue. That progress was based on our 2018 budget, and I'm also would say that an atmosphere of trust has been developed by the board and Dr. Boone and the executive and her executive team. She has a great team. They're not flashy, but we found out that flash doesn't work, but they're steady and very competent. So with that in mind, I believe that this is a reasoned and reasonable budget. It is a budget that reflects our school board and division priorities. It is equity-based or equity-sensitive, as for instance in the outstanding example of incentives for hard-to-staff schools, which we are giving $0.3 million for that. And so I am glad to be able to see that. I believe that this budget builds incrementally on our last budget, and with the incremental building of budgets that can be supported politically, we will be positioned to realize and support the rising academic gains we are beginning to see. Because I believe that Dr. Boone and her executive team are making some wise decisions, I am confident that where we need changes in staffing, where we need to align staffing or curriculum which would have budget implications, that they will bring that forth to us. I'm confident that that is so, and I believe that, and so I have not sought to make a determination as to where we need to have additional staff or allocation or realignment of staff, because I believe that the executive team can do that in a much better fashion than I myself. I am very pleased to see the compensation and benefit package that we're offering. I believe that it's encouraging when looked at as a whole. They are broad and deep, supporting both teachers, bus drivers, long-term substitutes, across the board. And so not only do we see this raise for starting teachers of putting them up at $44,000, but more importantly, we see the incremental or the increase of steps across the board, anywhere from 3.1 to 3.2% for teachers and administrators and support staff, and even a 6.2% for bus drivers. This will take away the incentive for our teachers to go to that other school division seeking an incentive on the step increases. So I'm pleased to see that we've done this. When you look at this package, you have to look at it as a whole to understand how much it is benefiting our teachers. My area of concern is that of capital needs and repair and maintenance. I already know that the resources that have been allocated for this area is certainly not enough. That area is like a black hole. I mean, we can't give enough money to that, and so I understand that there is a need for a study of this area between the city and the division. I know this type of close look is forthcoming, and that will give us a better idea of how to meet the needs of our capital needs. So overall, I would say to you that for a balanced budget, this is a prudent budget, and I'm fully in support of it.
Any questions for Reverend Haywood? Anything else you'd like to add, Reverend Haywood, this time? All right, Ms. Doyle. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Robison.
Is it truly a balanced budget? Or is it because we have to ask for additional funds?
I think in the terminology we used last week with a balanced budget, balanced with the funds, the additional funds we are requesting.
Okay.
We got to that balance point based on that. Any movement away from the total request puts us out of balance.
Thank you for the clarification.
Ms. Doyle?
So Dr. Boone and Ms. Ingram, thank you for putting the package together. I thought it was very well thought out. I think you've considered some of the issues and concerns and initiatives that we have put forward as a board for several years, and so you're just furthering the progress we're making in those areas, so I appreciate that. I also appreciate where we felt like we needed to cut, and I think it's important for the community to understand we're not asking for more without asking ourselves what is it that we can do without or should do without with enrollment declines and with other reasons and for other reasons. So I think we need to articulate that well so that people, again, just don't think we're asking for more without tightening our own belt. I also appreciate that you took the conservative approach initially with the previous governor's figures so that we are working from a more conservative baseline and not working from either the Senate or the House, given that we now know the budget is now in flux. So I appreciate that conservative fiscal approach because I think that will do us well when after April 11th or whomever, whenever things get decided, I think we'll be in a better position to be agile and modify. Having said that, there are a few areas that I'd like to see areas of focus on. One is the CTE. You've heard this from us for many, many years. So for next year, I saw that we were going to add resources to Booker T. Washington for the STEAM arts side. But I think we should do even more. And whatever we can do more, and not just the baseline to get those 4 academies going, we need to do it and jumpstart it fast now. So just don't do the baseline to say we're going to start getting the curriculum going and start piloting and doing them this fall. Let's ramp up very quickly and add the necessary resources and funding to make those fully functioning right off the ground. Regarding our educational plan, one of the recommendations that we voted on right now was that St. Helena, fifth graders would matriculate over to Blair Middle School. And what I would ask is that we look at the reading and math scores of those students that are graduating from fifth grade and then arriving at Blair in sixth grade to determine if there are any additional resources we need to accommodate the needs of the students. I know in the budget book there's an enrollment projected decline at Blair, but it's not about the number of students, it's about the needs of the students. So I would ask that we look at the math and reading scores and determine if we need to add specialists and or other resources to Blair to help those children further their academic progress. And I did look at the scores from last year, so that's why I'm asking as well. Technology. Dr. Gabriel mentioned it earlier, and I agree that we need to start today putting together a multi-year plan for one-to-one. And one-to-one where a student can take home, have in school, use their own. And I know this is a multi-year plan, we cannot do this overnight, but at some point the state's going to mandate it and not fund it. So I think if we do this now and proactively prepare ourselves, we'll be in a better position when that mandate comes down the pike. I, of course, encourage us to continue with our educational planning, and if we can accelerate that in any way, and I know we're voting on some things in a few months, but to me, the more we can demonstrate how we are more efficiently operating as a division, the better we are. I do support the full-time grant. I know it's a part-time right now, but if we could move that to a 1.0 FTE, there is money out there to be had, and I think we're leaving money on the table by not having someone out there who's trying to get that for us. I do agree with the special education audit. I think that's a good approach. I think we've addressed special ed in terms of what we can do now on our own, but I think an outside audit would be helpful as well. I think that kind of wraps it up for me. Talked about technology, educational planning with the building consolidation, so that's just, I'll highlight that a bit. So with our educational plan, we're talking about potentially moving buildings into other buildings and programs into other buildings, and I think we need to do that sooner than later. And I know, for instance, with Camp Allen, we can't until the second half of the school gets constructed. That is logical, obviously. But wherever else we can make modifications with building use so that we're more efficient as a division and more agile as a division, I encourage us to really look at that strongly. And Brad, I think you do have a good idea of revisiting the economic impact study. I know you've mentioned that over the years, and there are many that would appreciate the hard dollar value that the school division brings to the community. You know, many people do have economic impact studies, and that makes a big difference in the community, and I think if we can quantify that, that will go a long way in helping us communicate our story. Let me check if there's anything else. Oh, and then I also want to commend you all for your focus on the impact aid. And that is, thank you for demonstrating last week, and I'll pull the presentation up, that you think we're going to get an additional, with your projections for 2019, we'll get additional revenue received, which is great. So I encourage us to continue that for as long as that aid is still available coming out of the federal government, which I know it's in question. However, for long as it's there, we need to maximize that as much as we can. So I think that wraps it up on my end.
Questions or comments for Ms. Doyle? All right. Well, I have just clarification. So on we know that we changed the pathway for St. Helena to go to Blair. Previously, they were on a pathway where they would have gone to Lake Taylor Middle. And if we look at reading and math scores of any of our students leaving fifth grade going to the middle school, are you suggesting or recommending that we only look at Blair, or are you recommending that we look at all of the elementary school pathways to middle school and to see if there are supports needed across the board?
Everywhere, absolutely, because that's where we're seeing the drop-off. So I just went back and looked at that because we've made that vote and made that change, but it really reinforces what Dr. Gabriel was saying about the middle school reinforcement. And to your point, Mr. Jordan, you were right. Some of our middle schools were actually very close to full accreditation. It was just 7 or 8 points off in English, right? So, and I feel good this year that they're going to probably cross the line there. But yes, wherever the resources are needed, not because of the number of students, but because of the need of the student. Even with a projected decline, perhaps in that school, the need is still there. And I think maybe last year, I know we had to balance a budget. I think maybe we did a little bit too severely cut back on some of the specialists. I understand why we did it, but I think perhaps the pendulum needs to swing back, again, based on the needs of the students.
Ms. Doyle? I'm sorry, Dr. Gabriel?
So, to your point, if we look at our middle schools, and if it means going back and looking at elementary school, as far as the fifth graders are starting at third grade, fourth grade to fifth grade to see what the pattern is, that would be included in where I would say if the division is, which I know that they are, looking at how we can accelerate that progress and within the NPS redesign. So it's not confined to just middle school, but if it means looking back at fifth grade, fourth grade, so that the acceleration is seen in middle school as well, then that's where I would say if resources are needed, let's put them there.
Yeah, I think that part of to the board's credit in working with Dr. Boone and the team, I think we've been following that and been pushing it, but I think we can come back and look at it. I would like to think that as part of the work that they put forward to us, that they've looked at those things, but I think it's important that we make sure that we let the administration know that if they need more, and it's going to be managed, because I know one of the things we always talk about is having all of those resources and then having all the supports that you need to manage those resources towards effective outcomes. Sometimes you build upon, but definitely I understand where you're coming from with that.
The data's there certainly when it comes to those who have an opportunity for academic achievement further than today. And then math and reading, we got to get those specialists in there, and where we perhaps pull back, we need to revisit. And I understand we did it for budgetary reasons, I get it, but that's where we need to prioritize differently.
I think part of it was budgetary and part of it was implementation.
And role-based.
Right.
What role is to serve in what area. I understand that as well. Right.
Okay. Anything else?
No, thank you.
All right. Ms. Basine, you're up.
Well, I too, like those before me, think that this is a well thought out budget, and also I appreciate the conservative fiscal approach, given the uncertainty at the state level. I have some priorities as well as some questions, which I can address the questions later if you prefer. But I will start with, so my 3 priorities were around compensation, which has been addressed in here, and I'm so happy to see that focus. My second priority was around social and emotional mental health and whatever resources that we need to ensure full implementation of our wellness as well as our suicide prevention policy, which we had indicated previously that may include wellness champions in each of our schools and may include and involve training and staff to specifically address the needs of our students as well as staff. My third priority area is special education. I'm heartened to hear that it sounds like we're moving toward a consensus of the board to have a special education audit. I think every year, I know several of us, myself included, have lots of questions about resources, whether we need more ABA-trained individuals and staff to really move the needle. We've had such small movement in that subgroup of students that I think we've really got to take a hard look at what resources are available and what we need to do to really move that subgroup into a higher performing and increasing accessibility to opportunities for children with IEPs. I do have questions about the behavioral specialists, especially as we talk about in-school suspension and what role they would play. I guess I need a little bit of more clarity about what they are, not to dictate whether, we have enough or not enough. I just need to know exactly what role they might play. And the question about whether we expand in-school suspension or we expand behavioral specialists. And that's just something, I'd like to hear some feedback on about that. Because theoretically, we could possibly reduce the need of in-school suspension if we have the behavioral specialists in place. So I had a question about efficiencies in transportation. And I see that we have included a transportation supervisor to take care of after-school concerns of parents. And similar to Dr. Gabriel, I was, thinking about, while the costs may be greater up front, are there strategies such as GPS to include that may negate the need of this transportation supervisor depending on, what that role of that supervisor would be. Just going through my notes here. I also need to better understand the employee benefits as we talk about this, putting teachers on a competitive pay scale, what that really, because that's something that we hear a lot about, at least I'm hearing a lot about it from the community, that there are still concerns that we're not really giving a pay increase or putting teachers and staff on a competitive pay scale because the employee, the insurance premiums are put on the employee. So I need to better understand that. I think it's important for all of us to better understand that so we can more effectively communicate that. Literacy. In the past, we have talked, I think literacy needs to be, and I speak preaching to the choir here because I think we're all in agreement about focus on literacy. But we had talked about in the past a subscription to Wilson Reading, I believe, and had partially or were piloting it in a smaller group. And I know, if I recall correctly, that it is a costly subscription, if I'm using the right term. If that is something that we're seeing improvements, because we've had some great improvement in literacy in the past year, and if there's something that we can do to further enhance that, I'd like us to consider that as well, especially as we also need to consider the dyslexia training and resources that may be associated with that. And honestly, those were my big budget areas.
Any questions or points of clarification with Ms. Bassim? Beyond the special ed audit and the GPS on, what I understand you're asking us to really consider is you support the providing support, funding support if needed for the special ed audit. And then. Can I make a clarification too?
So special ed audit, but we also talked about last year, at the same time, we talked about gifted resource review. And we're still, I'm glad to see that there weren't any further cuts in that area, but I think we need that review to really have a good discussion around what resources are necessary so that we can make budgetary decisions. So, I have the two of them together as reviews, special education and gifted review. I wanted to make that point clear. And the other budgetary resource that I want to make clear, so when we talk about, our wellness and mental health infrastructure, a few years ago, we also had a wellness coordinator, a health and wellness coordinator. That could be something that we may potentially partner with the city in achieving, or that's something that we could put in our budget. And I guess my question is, could we add that? Will we need that? And I'll, defer to the team to let us know, but if that is something that the team feels is necessary, then I would advocate to include that.
All right, any questions at all for Ms. Basine from colleagues? Dr. Gabriel?
It's not directly for Ms. Basine, but what might be helpful as far as understanding the compensation with regards to the benefits is maybe just take a random sampling of 3 employees and say, this is what their salary is, obviously no names attached, but then to say, this is what they're paid, this is what they're going to look like if they are on the second portion of the compensation study, and then with their benefits, this is what their take-home pay is. That might just make it clear for everyone, because there is a lot of discussion out there about, oh, well, we're getting a raise, but then we're getting the health insurance tacked onto it, so it's really a negative compensation towards us. So that's just a suggestion.
Yeah, and actually, because Ms. Wagner raised that at the last work session, and I am anticipating that we get to the response from Dr. Boone and from some Q&A that they probably have prepared some information for us. So, anything else, Ms. Basine, at this time?
Not at this time.
Ms. Wagner, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, I too would like to thank the individuals for putting the budget together. I know that it's not an easy task, and I can't do it. So I know it's okay. No, I was just saying, thanking them for putting the budget together, because I know it's not an easy task, and it's something that I truly cannot do. So I know it's hard. One of the things that that has really been a concern for me is I probably look at the news too much, but just aware that today is the 14th where kids are walking out, then we look at the 24th in which they're going to be doing the march. And I know Dr. Boone talked about, when I asked the question about safety in the high schools, and we talked about the fact that everyone has to buzz in. And I guess one of my concerns is that, and buzzing is good. I think that's a good first step. But a lot of times as we go to the buildings and we buzz in, if we hit the buzzer, do they really ask? And then maybe they need some training on, let's hype up our safety in terms of that. Because you can just come on in and they're not asking who it is or whatever. And they can't see who it is. And so even if I gave a wrong name and they let me in, and I don't know if we can do cameras or whatever, but it is a concern in terms of safety. The other thing is with our elementary schools, and I do, look at the parents from Sandy Hook, and it is an issue. And if it's any way that we can look at the budget in terms of putting something more into the elementary schools so that we can at least try and assure more of a safety issue for those buildings, I think that would be something we should look into. I agree with the special ed audit. One of the other things along with the audit that I think I would like to see us just assess some of the other alternative programs around, just to give parents, and I know that we've done some and we have one that we've been using for a period of time, but if we could just look at some of the other programs, assess them, and maybe give parents more options. That may be something that maybe reduce some of the anxiety and say that we have at least reviewed more of the other programs. And cost. Funding for buses, and of course the GPS, but I'd also like for us to look at funding for buses in terms of safety for students. I know that last year one of the things that I did put in the budget, and of course in terms of limited funding, was the kids coming from public housing that have to go through the overpass, and when it floods, and even if they get caught at school and it floods, it's very difficult for them to get home. So let's kind of, and not just for that area, but kind of review safety issues in terms of students in buses and them getting home safely, and whether or not there's a need to put buses in other places. I know I've said this over and over again, but another concern, overage for grade. When you look at the research, it talks about little boys, especially African-American young men, something happens in that 4th grade. And they just kind of lose it. If we could just look at it, what happens and how do our kids get to overage for grade? I know some of it has to do with special ed and inclusion and those kinds of things, but when they get there, is there any way that we can provide some kind of services for them so that once they leave, even if they don't get the high school diploma, that they have some kind of skill so that when they leave Norfolk Public Schools, they do have something to fall back on and say that I can do X, Y, and Z. I know we have the vocational program. Again, I do know the criteria is very high for some of the students to get into, i.e. state or whatever. But I do think that we have several kids, if we're looking at the holistic school system and how we can save. I know we can't save them all, but maybe put something in place so that we can at least look at those kids and reduce some of those numbers. Grant writing, and I have to agree with Ms. Doyle on that. I know we've been discussing that for a couple of years here, but I think that we need to maybe be more aggressive in terms of finding someone because we don't know what's going to happen in terms of funding. We do have, in terms of behavior, we have the programs that are in the school, but if something happens in terms of Medicaid, they're gone, and what's our plan B? So I think in terms of looking for other resources, that we do need a fallback, and a grant writer is certainly, to me, a priority, because we do have to look at other funding. Looking at the behavior program, I guess I have a question in terms of, do we have, what is the school-wide discipline program? Is it still PBIS, or it is PBIS? So, okay. Wasn't sure, once we put the discipline people in place and how they work, they coordinate with that program. So just a question about how that works. I do have a question about what I would like to see more equity in programming for all schools to enhance all of the programs in every school across the curriculum. And let's prioritize in terms of what schools have and what schools, the haves and the have-nots, and see if we can get the have-nots at least halfway up to where I'd like to see them at least on the same plane as in terms of the schools that have what is needed. Recruitment of teachers, and I know that we do the job fairs or whatever, but I would like to see us maybe reach out more, even beyond where we are in Hampton Roads Regional, whatever. Collaborate with some of the other schools, some of the other HBCs or whatever, and see if we can get the best and the brightest or whatever. And I'm glad that we have put something in place for those hard to staff schools. And maybe if we reach across nationally, we maybe have to do a better job of finding the kind of teachers that we need, or teachers who are willing to come in and work with the students that are the at-risk students. The other question that I had to do with what's left to do in terms of the budget. The what's left to do, when we do that, does it put the budget out of balance? Is that part of the budget, or how does that fit in? I guess I don't really understand. Oh yeah, right here, what's left to do? And I know the salary increase, phase 3 new specialty program, I see the list, but how does that fit into the budget? Is that extra, or it's extra? So, and these are some things that we probably are going to implement starting in September. And so, they're not funded. Okay, which brings me back to, if they are not funded, and I know we've talked about that we're going to be implementing, and we have applications out. I guess it's not clear to me. Yeah, okay. I need some clarity in terms of, are we moving too fast because we're saying that we're going to do this, but we're not really funding it? If we're not funding, where do we go with this? And how do we look in terms of the public if we're not sure? And I guess that's me.
Okay. So you had keeping track of what? First, anyone have any questions or comments from Ms. Wagner?
Question.
You have a question? Okay, Dr. Boone.
The one clarification question I had dealt with,
when you mentioned the special ed audit, but then you said, look at other alternative ed programs and give parents some options. I'm not sure, because special education is not, in my mind, alternative education. And so I'm trying to see, are you talking about beyond what we've initially done with our alternative ed review around Madison and those programs, or are you talking about something else?
I'm really talking about something else. And probably because of we've had parents that have come to us, autism or whatever, and they are suggesting that there are other programs other than what we have. And my suggestion is, we have that in place, and I know this is something we've been doing for a while, that we maybe take a look at other facilities so that we can say, and so that we can give parents options. And just assess them to see what it is.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You have a question?
Well, I agree with Ms. Wagner on that point, and I guess I was foreseeing that as potentially as being part of the special ed audit, in terms of how many students are opting or not able to be, or it could be. We'll talk about that when. But along the alternative education piece, the one, question I have, and of course this isn't a time to start asking for a review on this, but at some point in the future, there's a number, this is tied into the piece around mental health, that there are students that are requesting, homebound instruction. And I don't know what the status of that is. I guess my question is just, as far as we talk about alternative resources or programs or schools, do we have the resources necessary to meet that need? And I don't know what that need is, but, that's just a general question about that.
Just in fairness to both of you, I know that so when I was kind of working to put together this process to make sure everybody had the opportunity to speak, one of the things I asked of Dr. Boone was to really allow the board to have this initial conversation, because she did her first step of her job of providing a recommendation to the board, and now we're trying to do our job. So I don't want you to think that she's ignoring the questions. She's taking notes, but I wanted us to kind of be able to talk about some of these things ourselves, so we just didn't end up in a back and forth with the superintendent and not be able to drive down towards what, as a board, we would like to address with the budget. So I just wanted you all to understand why she is over here.
I'm enjoying the silence.
With blood coming down the side. So she's fine. Anything else for Ms. Wagner?
Yeah, I do want to say something in terms of the mental health issue and addressing that. And I don't know how we can address more of that. And I share this because I have a granddaughter that was diagnosed with some mental health issues, anxiety, that kind of thing. And what happened was there were some gang activity or something at Norview at one point. But and I can't remember what was all going on. We actually had to pull her out, and we did homeschool. And of course, homeschool is becoming a big thing right now. And once we did the homeschool and looked into the homeschool society, I realized that there were so many parents that were doing that, and because of that. So I guess that's something that we really do need to look into, because we are losing students because of that. Some homeschooling may be the route that they take, but it may be some other things that we can address to keep some of our students, because even with that, they miss out on the social issues. And even though they have the homeschool society, there's still some things in terms of sports or whatever that they can't get involved in. So mental health is truly something that we need to address.
Let me get in here. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
I think that the mental health issue is very significant. I just wonder how we have such a great resource in CHKD, and they are developing a new behavioral health center, if we might be able to bridge resources with them so that it doesn't come out of the pocket of our school division, but allow the true medical needs to be accessed, and for the insurance and whatever, the resources are that can be provided through the health perspective. But being that the kids are in school, and this is where we can take advantage of them here, provide that therapy or that treatment. I would like, if we can find that area to compromise on or work together on, I think that would probably be very, very beneficial.
Okay, can you put me on the clock for 10 minutes, please? All right. That's right. No, I have not. No, it's okay. Many of the things in terms of the work that's been done on the budget, the accolades that have been given, I agree with. I actually don't like budget season because I think the way the system is designed, where there's this focus annually, it draws school board members into looking at things in a one-year chunk versus a multi-year chunk. You know, when Dr. Stewart was on the board, he would always recommend and advise us that we look at our budgeting and our planning over a multi-year cycle and try to align the capital needs, the budget needs, and the academic and programmatic needs together. But I think we have done, and I think Dr. Boone has done a very good job of getting us on that path. So as we talk about phase 2 of the pay and comp study, to me that is another building block. Likewise with the alternative ed, I think there are a lot of strengths in the division that we don't always highlight because obviously the needs grab a lot of attention. But I do see the building blocks, and I just want to make sure that this budget is supporting the building blocks, or even as has been said earlier, in some cases, accelerating, which I think is occurring. And another reason I don't like this time of the year is we spend so much time, work session after work session, business meeting after business meeting, discussing a lot of things, looking at policies and their impact. And it just seems like somehow at this time of the year that it's like there's this pressure, like, okay, we've laid out these building blocks, but how do we try to cram it all in one year? And I know we're not trying to do that, but I think there's just the nature of the beast kind of gives that feel to it. So I do have some specific, at least to me, recommendations I'd like for the board to consider. Mention this at the work session. Because we're putting so much energy and effort into educational planning and looking at research and data, as we've, as we were talking about the attendance zones and boundaries associated with high schools and CTE and so forth, I feel like we need to, if it's not a new position, then perhaps it's new support in the research and educational planning area, so that we have someone who has the capacity for GIS analysis. In my notes I was writing to you all, I see I cut something off, but with cooperative strategies, there's Lee Wang who works with them. I was trying to say I think we need a Lee Wang type, that so we don't have to necessarily depend upon the city to produce maps for us, or to be able to do analysis, or constantly look outside the of our department to do that. So I don't know if it's a new budgetary position or if it's just added capacity, but I like to see our budget support that, because I think that the demands that are going to come for something like that are just going to grow. In the past, we had set aside a fund or a set of funds for legal assistance if the superintendent of the board needed it beyond what we currently receive from the city attorney's office. I think a few years ago we put maybe $25,000 in that. I like to recommend that we add another 50 to it, so we have that available.
No, I'm asking a question over there.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. We talked about the grant writer position. I also think that we should go ahead and make that a fully funded position if that's what it's going to take for us to get competitive applicants for that. You all know we're in the midst of, last year the board asked for, one of the things we put in our accountability plan and also looked at with our scheduling, we were trying to revisit how we do volunteers and a lot of other things that were falling under the Norfolk Education Foundation, and we also were having discussions around how do we revisit that whole relationship. So I would recommend that while we're still in the midst of figuring that piece out, that may be funds that we have directed towards the NEF Executive Director position, that we could offset some of that towards the grant writer, and at least have that grant writer on board while we continue to determine the relationship with the Education Foundation. Just a common question, the document, the budget recommends doing some balancing with long-term subs. Just like to get more clarity on that, to see where those long-term subs are and how it impacts the equity that we talked about and Ms. Wagner just mentioned. We were supposed to be moving towards a shared funding formula with the city, and from what I can tell, it hasn't advanced. So I think maybe the board should take on the responsibility of funding an independent consultant to come and look at that and make some recommendations, so if that's what's necessary so it's not this give and take between the school board and the city council, or the school administration and the city administration. I think we need to make a determination as to whether or not it's a good thing for the city of Norfolk to consider. And so maybe we can put together a request, in our request to the city, to fund a consultant and just have a consultant come in and lead that work, so we can determine whether it's something that we do or not do. On the specialty program recommendation that we received, as we reviewed it back during one of our work sessions, there was a recommendation that a specialty program or magnet program coordinator be established in order to help facilitate that work. So I like to hear from the administration if we don't have that position, or if someone else in the division is going to be doing that role, then maybe we should consider as a board go ahead and funding that position, because again, I think it all ties back to our ed planning. We received a letter from the Gifted Education Advisory Committee. One of the things that they seem to indicate is they believe that our identification process is straining the GRT allocation, if I read it correctly.
I haven't seen that.
Oh, you hadn't seen that? Okay, I'll forward that to you. If that's the case, I'd just like for us to get some clarity around their assessment and where we are, and whether or not, to me, it kind of goes to the gifted resource alignment. I thought you had seen that, but I'll send that to you. Then the other piece that I think is more programmatic than budgetary, and I admit may be below the line, but one of the things that we talked about with the mixed income pre-K was supporting the mixed income pre-K, which I'm wholeheartedly supportive of. We know that eventually, if we fund that and that's supported, that the administration will determine its location. I just would like for us to, as part of that, consider doing an assessment of Berkeley Early Childhood Center as a potential location, because I think it would be nice to have that tied in with the Apple Connect Ed program that they have there, and it kind of ties back to the whole technology exposure piece. So if supported, I'm guesstimating that new recurring costs that I would be adding would be the research position, and that would be whatever the salary and benefit range would be. Likewise for the specialty/magnet program coordinator. And then one-time costs would be the legal funds, and then also whatever the funds may be to find an independent consultant to come in and work on the shared funding. I'm also supportive of the special education audit. I don't know if that's a budgetary piece or not, but I think, as we've talked about in the past, that there's some existing audit that's underway. But I think one of the things we would need to do as a board and work with the administration is kind of define and have an understanding of what is currently underway versus what it is that we're asking for, and what the delta is in between. So those are pretty much my requests or recommendations, so to speak, at this stage of the process. Again, I think that we're in a very good place in terms of the work that we're building upon from the first year to the second year and now going into the third year. And I'm glad about the bus drivers and the compensation that's being done there. I think we're doing a very good job around the compensation piece. So I'll stop there for now. Did I do good? Do well? Okay. All right.
They had questions for you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, do you have questions for me? I'm sorry. Thank you, Dr. Boone.
You talked about expanding the additional pre-K slots to Berkeley.
Not expanding, so in the, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well,
finish.
do we have the capacity there?
Well, that's my question. So
Okay.
when I'm in the proposed budget, we've talked about, because we were losing the VPI slots,
Right.
that I thought the administration, personally, I think did a brilliant thing in recommending this gives us an opportunity to do the mixed income pre-K. At the time that we discussed it last week, as I understood it, if we approve that, we would have these classrooms, I think it was 3, but we had not determined yet where they would go. I'm just simply saying that as part of that assessment, if we would consider the Berkeley Early Childhood as one of those locations and do an assessment there. Yeah.
And the only reason I asked that is because we moved all the temporary classrooms that we had out there, or have we?
No,
Go ahead.
we haven't moved them all. And then
Oh, okay.
remember, we've also lost pre-K classrooms the prior year across the district, 14 classrooms.
Anything else for me? For me?
Yes.
Okay.
I just, as the board liaison to the GIAC, just wanted to clarify what the discussion is, if you think that this is a good time to do that, or
We'll do it after the break.
After the break,
And
okay.
also give me a chance to forward the letter to Dr. Boone.
okay.
I'm not gonna deal with that today. I mean, I'm
Okay.
saying, I'm not prepared
Right.
to respond to a letter I received
Yeah.
on site today.
Okay, that's fine.
I'll provide a response to the board.
Yeah.
No, it's just context for it, but we can,
But that wasn't one of the ones I'm gonna address in my time.
okay. Well,
Okay.
we'll come back to that.
Yeah, we can come back to that.
Maybe you have something for me?
Yes.
Okay.
You mentioned legal assistant.
Assistance.
Assistant, are you talking about one?
No, it's
two?
a fund, so.
Oh, a fund.
Yeah, remember, and it was prior to Dr. Boone's arrival, I believe, but we were just trying to say that if we felt that there were needs, in some cases, because the city attorney is also our attorney, sometimes it seems like we need some independent counsel. Sometimes it just may be based upon skill sets. So I think what the board had agreed in the past was we were setting funds aside, so if we found that we had a need for that, it would be available. I'm just recommending that, because I don't think last year we added more to it. So basically, I'm taking $25,000, I don't think we added last year, plus $25,000 for this year, and add to it, because I think initially we were trying to get it up to at least $100,000, I think it was. So it's not for a particular person, it's just to have that resource available if the superintendent of the board feels it needs outside counsel.
So just clarification, you're recommending to get it up to 50, or you want to
I'm
add 50
recommending
more?
that we add 50 more
50 more
to
to get it to
that
75?
line item, get a total of 75.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, I support that. I had requested that we consider that previously as well. I also support the need to look at whether an additional staff or resource be used for our research and assessment department, or whether it be a consultant, but something to enhance our capacity in that realm.
Anything else at this point? We're going to take a break. I'm going to come back to you, but is anything that you would like to get some clarity on as the board as a whole? I mean, the goal was to try to narrow down in some areas. I think you've heard some areas where there's some commonality, others where I think we still have independent interests, but you feel comfortable with
I think I
where
have
we
the
are?
information I need to respond.
Okay, so let's do this then. It's 5:14. Maybe we can take I think we're a little bit ahead of what I calculated would be our schedule. If we can take about a 10-minute break and refresh with water or whatever it is anyone needs to do. So if we can come back at 5:25, then we can have Dr. Boone respond to some of the questions and comments that we had, and then we can see where we are prior to entering into the public hearing. So we will break until 5:25. All right, I want to call our work session back to order. So we had an opportunity during the previous portion to have the board to share some thoughts individually and collectively. So now I'm just going to turn things over to Dr. Boone. She can share any information she'd like to share with us, respond to any questions, or give us any thoughts on what she's heard. And then if there's some additional questions that we have, just as a reminder, you know, our goal is after this public hearing and at, next week, we had on hold a work session period for us to continue it. I'm pretty certain we're going to use that work session time to make sure that we're in sync with what our school board budget final draft would be. But for now, I'm just going to turn things over to Dr. Boone and allow her to flow in any way that she would like to do so. So, Dr. Boone.
Thank you. I truly enjoyed the opportunity to listen to the thoughts of the board members based on your experience as board members, your experiences in what you may do each and every day, and passions that you have and interests that you have. I think in big buckets, if you will, recognizing that buckets are filled with lots of things at different places. One of the things that I need to say going forward, it is not a pushback. It is an intentional reminder to the board. Dr. Robison asked the question, what did balanced budget mean? It meant it's balanced with the additional funds we built into that budget. You know, I love my example of an algebraic equation. It's never balanced until both sides are dealt with. And so there are a lot of things that have fiscal implications. There are some things that are going to be a challenge for us to accomplish outside of money in this current budget. I think Dr. Robison was the one I made notes of some recommendations he had for FY19 that will be helpful going forward. What are some absolutes that you are trying to see in this budget? But the algebraic equation is our desires and what's the revenue on the other side. We did an exercise last year, and I think it was a good one in terms of reacting and responding to governance team goals and desires, community goals and desires, and at the end, the needle didn't move because we didn't get the revenue that we needed for that. I strongly encourage the board to use that as a reminder as we get to, as the board makes its final decisions in terms of what is submitted to the city for consideration, that whatever goes in, because we've only, either we forgot to grow the revenue request or we're going to have to reduce some other things that are currently in the budget. I stated last week that this was essentially a no-growth budget. Through some restructuring of dollars and stop doing some things and some efficiencies that we found within existing funds, we've been able to accomplish some new things or change direction on certain things. The majority of the new money goes to supporting our pay and comp study. And so when I mentioned to the board, when I say we have to stop doing other things, because of the right sizing that we needed to do to deal with our structural imbalance on the budget, that's why you don't see a lot of recommendations for reductions of positions other than those connected to potential enrollment loss. Beyond the pay and comp piece, then everything else gets into our deeper programmatic issues. And in my notes, I hear a lot of expansion of certain things, a lot of other things to do. And I didn't hear anything that I didn't think was a good idea. And I would probably say 95% of those we vetted in terms of our process that was this wide and became this narrow in terms of what we did. We discussed it again yesterday in the district leadership team meeting, the fact that a couple of years ago, we wouldn't have been ready for the type of budgeting exercise we went through this year, where we were able to call down all of the requests, and it wasn't a territorial fight in terms of, well, I'm just here, I need my item to go forward. But really, it was focused on what have we committed to with the redesign? What are the needs that we have in order to move the level on student achievement, and how do we accomplish that sooner than later? And so that's the way in which we approach this. And so I'm so very proud of the team, given the fact that what landed in this budget, what wound up in this budget from the district leadership team, went through a similar process that the board is engaged in now. And we found some common themes. And even with some common themes, some of the common themes didn't make it to the table quite yet. So I just want to share that as context for the board. But because we aren't proposing lots of bold and grandiose new things, we're doing bold things, we're taking strategic action, but we're doing it within a modest income piece. One of the things that we've heard repeatedly during the budget cycle in conversations with the city is that the city's anticipated revenue growth is roughly 2% for this year. The proposed budget submitted to the board last week has a 1.2% growth. You may ask, well, why are you sharing that? Because you can anticipate that if our budget growth goes beyond 2%, that we're asking the city's contribution to overall contribution, and you can anticipate then the response from that. So again, not siding with the city, but I think it's realistic that when we decide what it is that we want to put our stake in the ground for, that we understand what it's going to take to accomplish it. So that being said, I talked about big categories and themes. So I kind of jotted down a few terms. Those areas that have true fiscal impact, those that are considered as non-fiscal, and you may say, well, everything else you're saying is non-fiscal, but I put non-fiscal in terms of just some tweaking or things we could do to accomplish certain things so it doesn't have a fiscal impact. There are policy implications, there are training implications, and there's advocacy. And that's where we have to make sure what decisions we're making. But that's the way I see them: fiscal, non-fiscal, policy, training, and advocacy. I'm very glad that we had the retreat day in February so that we could talk about the redesign and talk about our efforts going forward. I will constantly direct us back to the redesign work, because when there are questions about what are we doing for certain things, that is our answer. That will continue to be our answer. And we're beginning to see the progress of that work going forward. So in just a minute, I'll address some of the thoughts. In putting things in those big categories, obviously, I'm not going to go item for item and respond to the board. But I am going to comment on about a handful of the major areas. And again, they are not a priority that I've set, but those are ones that I heard across board members multiple times, and I think they warrant then at this, hearing these, some response. There are some things that we had already started working on as a result of last week's discussion around the board, so you'll hear us mention a couple of things that may not have come up today, but we are answering questions from last week also. So these are the areas that I see as big themes, and I probably won't, I may take them in this order, may not, but technology, the educational planning, budgetary and district operation efficiencies, the special education audit, middle school as well as overall student achievement, grant writer, mental health, and CTE. Let me do one, which is efficiencies around health insurance. If it was appropriate, Dr. Robinson, I would have stood up and hugged you when you addressed the health insurance piece. And the reason being, you all heard me last week talk about some of my frustrations that are mounting as it relates to our the functioning of the healthcare consortium that includes Norfolk Public Schools, the City of Norfolk, and the Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority. Two items that I have put on the table, and very specifically back last spring, and have hounded those home for the last several months, dealt with how do we address healthcare costs without thinking the only way to do it is to pass it on to the employees. That's the very specific question in the statement that I made. In that discussion, I talked about three specific things that would help Norfolk Public Schools, and I believe the consortium, and would help us with our cost and all of those pieces. One deals with moving us from a planned contribution to a defined contribution level, meaning that based on whether you're employee only or what it is, employee and family, whatever that model is, that an employee would know this is the amount of money they are receiving, then they have the choice to select a plan that best meets their needs because they know what the district will be contributing. What we currently have now is that over time, our contribution levels by employees have not kept pace with the demands of the healthcare system. I have some information I'll share with you in just a couple of minutes regarding, which is counter to what you say you're hearing in the community, that health insurance costs are eating up raises. I will show you the evidence that that is not true. I think the confusion becomes, and we started talking a little bit about this last week, that a raise percentage and a health insurance percentage don't equal the same dollars. So a 2% increase on a health care, or 1% or whatever that amount is, 2% on the health care, for some folks could be as low as 58 cents per pay period, because it's not taxed on the total income that a person would get with a 2% increase or a 3% increase. So I think that's where the real misunderstanding happens. And one of the opportunities I always see with the budget process is both to educate ourselves better and to educate our employees and the community better in terms of a lot of technical language we use around budgets. But the health insurance percentage increase that would be shared with employees does not equal the same number of dollars that would be addressed as far as a raise would be concerned. Now, because raises have ranges, absolutely, it would be different for some folks, but the majority of the people would not see any significant impact on the raise that they would receive if we're able to move forward with the pay and comp as recommended. So that's the first piece of that. The second piece is I have asked for us to look, again, for opportunities where we aren't just moving the cost to the employees, but both the pharmacy and eventually down the road, our own short-term or medical facility as a way of containing our costs. Unfortunately, not been able to get the consortium to understand my knowledge of insurance and move away from a one path, which is just simply passing it on to the employees. Now, as I said to the board in March of 2016, we couldn't continue what we've been doing, and that's why I've been trying to work within the consortium to do that. I'm actually sending some information to the consortium later today, early tomorrow, for them to consider. But I am becoming increasingly frustrated that as we're the largest participant in the consortium, our requests are pretty much falling on deaf ears. So that the board will know the Norfolk Redevelopment and Housing Authority currently has a defined contribution model. So it's not foreign to the consortium. So that's what I'm going to say on the consortium. But let me share, and I believe Ms. Ingram has a handout that we'll provide to you, because again, these are some of the things that we were working from last week's discussion in order to be able to provide to the board. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, certainly if you have questions, because I don't want to eat up my time, and we're going to be done at 6:30. In this handout, you will see the current calendar year insurance premium cost for the district. And what you see are the various plans that are offered. You will remind the board that our health insurance goes on a calendar year versus the July to June fiscal year. And that's one of the requests that I constantly have for the consortium that they have not helped me meet yet, and that is the fact that we need insurance information by February so that we can build it into our budget, because a mid-year shift to tell our employees, because by law we're required to do our contracts for continuing folks by June 30th. They need to know what will be the impact should there be any insurance changes later. The best we got out of that this year was the fact that we're looking at that 2% increase, which is very nominal considering the last several years, almost the last decade, that has been pretty close to double digits, if not above. So on the first page, you see the three different plans, with Plan C being the highest option plan. Excuse me. So you see what the total monthly premium is. You see the dollar amount for the monthly school board contribution. You then see the percent of monthly contribution. I think it's important to pause here because the contribution that the board is paying ranges from 72% to 98%. This is the structural imbalance that I've been talking about. We presented to the board an example of this at Ruffner in March of 16 in a work session, but we bring it back to you here. This is the piece that the city constantly hammers on us, that we haven't addressed our contribution rates, which would create some savings within our budget. I don't disagree with them, but what I disagree with them is the fact that the only way we get at it is having the employees pay a larger share. That's why I want to go to the defined contribution model, and we need someone other than the current consortium members to help develop those figures of what that looks like. So then you see the employee monthly contribution. And the range of the employee contribution goes from 1.9% to 30% of the total monthly cost. Okay? This first page is for non-tobacco users. If you don't smoke and you take the if you don't smoke, you get one level of premium, which is pretty standard in the market. And if you do the annual health risk assessment, you get a monthly rebate of $12 off your premium. So those are some of the things that have been in place. We also, with Norfolk Public Schools, cover health insurance over 10 months rather than 12, because not all of our employees are 12-month employees, so that's pretty standard in education. The second page is the similar one. These are the premiums based on calendar year 2019, the budget that we are planning for. And you see again the same range of contribution for the employee and you see those targets for employees and the school board. But if you look at Optimal Plan A, employee only, school board contribution, 98% of that plan. The employee monthly contribution in the calendar year 18, which we're currently in, is $13. The monthly contribution with that shared percentage would go up to $13.26 for the employee-only contribution monthly. So it's a 26-cent increase in the monthly contribution for the employee-only under Plan A. And so I just use that as an example of how this table works. And you see the comparison between the two calendar years. Following that, we have, again, the increase in insurance rates, just the example I just used, now from calendar year 18 to calendar year 19. So based on what the school board's monthly contribution is, and what the employee monthly contribution is, because of what we pay, you see what that looks like. And so you see those figures. Dr. Gabriel had mentioned showing examples. We have examples for you in various employee categories. Yeah, I've been doing this a little while. In employee categories. And so to the impact of the 2% increase in health insurance premiums. The first page are two different teachers, teachers. One is at the lower end of the scale, one is mid-scale in terms of steps 2 and 3 or step 10 and 11. How we've done this is shown what the gross pay is for both fiscal years, so where they are now, what it would look like with the pay and comp proposal that we've made to the board. So you see what the change would be in the gross pay per period. And so you see all of those pieces. When you move down to the health insurance that's highlighted, currently this particular example is employee only. It is paying $38.50 per month toward health insurance. With the changes for FY19, that will go to $39.27, an increase of 77 cents. So when you go back up to the gross pay changes, the gross pay is $47.46 per month. And, per pay period, per pay period, which is $98, $94, $95 per month. And the increase is 77 cents per pay period. So you see the impact on that individual will still bring home $46 and some change more than what they are currently making, even with the 2% increase.
Each pay period.
Each pay period. If you look down for a teacher in a family model, again, you will see what and this is a teacher who's at mid-career, well, mid-step. We can't equate that to careers, that's our challenge. Step 10, moving to step 11, along with that increase that we've talked about, what that would look like. You see their gross pay per pay period is $89.04. When you look down at the health insurance, this particular employee carries the family policy. They are currently paying $172.50 per pay period. In the new calendar year and fiscal year, the insurance increase would increase $3.45 to $175.95. So applying the same process, you take the $89.04 increase that they're making, subtract the $3.45, and you see that they are still receiving an increase per pay period over those insurance costs. I'm not going to go through all of the next pages, but we've also done other employee groups, teacher assistants, bus drivers, custodians, and assistant principals in terms of administrators. So we wanted to provide this in terms of answering some of the questions, hopefully around the impact of sharing. But I've got to work with the consortium or take us in a different direction if the consortium can't help us deal with that percent of monthly contribution. I'm working to and have experience in working in a way where we don't just pass that on to the employees as the only opportunity. That's very true, what we often see. That's what happens. If the insurance rates increase, Norfolk has, over the last probably 8 to 10 years or more, absorbed 100% of the increase in healthcare costs in order to offset some other things that weren't happening in the budget. So we've, in fiscal decisions that were made, we feel this imbalance, this structural imbalance. But we know with healthcare costs and things, this is not a model that we can sustain. This is impacting our budget, and so that's why I provided it. I don't know if you have any general questions about this.
Dr. Boone, if we are confined to the consortium, is it through the consortium that we would have to work if we were to explore options of the pharmacy or urgent care?
Exactly, and that's why I made my request at the consortium table. Now, one of the understandings that we've gained is that for a number of years, NPS may not have been physically at the consortium table. We are now. Ms. Ingram and Mr. Billups are the two who represent NPS at the consortium table in terms of the work. We then have, the city manager and I will have conversations and others will have conversations. But again, not unusual that the community, the city tends to manage that process a little more closely and not necessarily giving equity to those who participate in it. I will also remind the board that in 2013, I think it was, the decision was made to move the consortium for savings purpose from a self-insured entity, from a...
To self-insured.
Yeah, to move us from fully insured, right, to a self-insured. So fully insured meant we had a middle insurance company. The idea is this is supposed to create some savings. I'm working through to see what those savings have actually looked like over time. So that's some information that I'm requesting. Any other questions? Like I said, and in transparency for this budget, to those questions that often come up from elected officials or others in the community, what are you doing to address your efficiencies? If I had 100% control over this, we would have already addressed this. I don't have 100% control. I'm navigating the process as a consortium member, and will report to the board any next steps or recommendations I may have regarding that. But right now, we're trying to work through the consortium.
Ms. Bassine.
This may be a silly question, but is there anything the board can do to help you?
Not right now.
No? Okay.
Keep asking the questions.
Okay.
And keep making the statements that you've made. What have we done to think about controlling costs, such as pharmacists, in our own clinics or something? Because I've asked that too. And so I think one of the statements is that if accurate, if my assessment of the board is accurate, that now you have a clearer understanding of what we talk about around the health insurance, that we continue to acknowledge this is something we need to fix. But the fix rests with the consortium currently, and the consortium hadn't made that movement. So, even though, I tell you though, I wish some different fiscal decisions had been made in terms of sharing some of the costs. Even if you didn't share the increases 50-50, we would have been in a much better place. But you aren't going to find, you're going to probably anywhere, or maybe fewer than a handful of entities that are covering as much as 98% of the healthcare costs for its employees. You just aren't going to see that anymore. Someone represented the board as being, my budget as being fiscally conservative, and all of my family and friends try to figure out where that came from. I told them, when you're managing somebody else's money, you have a different mindset. Don't talk about my money, though. So that's one of those places with efficiencies. We've also, let me make one other comment, is that the transportation shifts that we have recommended and proposed in the budget are done within existing resources. And so that's where we talk about reprogramming dollars within transportation to do some things differently. I hear the request for the GPS. We will provide the cost for that, what it costs. You come closer.
It's $120,000. It's $30 per month per bus, 300 buses times 12. So it's $120,000.
$120,000
Annual cost.
annual cost per bus.
Yes, ma'am.
120 per bus.
No,
Oh,
no.
total.
Total.
$120,000 total annual cost for GPS on all of our buses.
So I'm not sure that that's the will of the board.
I'm
as
just
yet.
reporting.
Okay.
I'm just.
Because I was just asking and to
No,
clarify my
but
question.
again, when I heard
yeah.
things multiple times,
Okay.
I tried to put them in the big bucket.
Okay.
fine.
Okay, so that's the $120,000 for that. So these are some of the things. The special education audit, again, is something that I don't think requires a specific budgetary set-aside. But I do agree with the last comment Mr. Jordan made prior to the break in terms of setting the expectations for any audit. As I told you, we're going through federal program monitoring for Title I, special education, and Perkins, which is CTE. And so we will be coming back to the board later this spring, once we have all of those findings, and reporting to the board. But I do need to remind us that the special education process is defined in federal law, and we cannot take actions in an attempt to circumvent the IEP process that is well-defined within the special education regulations from the federal law and regulations from the federal and state level. So when I hear, you know, what are other facilities and things that are out there for folks, certainly when we start talking about what a special education audit will look like, I will ask us to, I certainly will present to the board, ways in which we can align that audit with the performance indicators that we're held accountable for, and not for some of the advocacy. You remember all my big items? Some of the advocacy needs, because, you know, as I said recently to the board, I can't even insert myself into an IEP. I can ask the questions, I can certainly ask others, have we thought about this? Have certain other practices occurred? You know, what do we do? But I can't demand that anything happens with an IEP. The board can't, the city manager can't, council can't, congressmen and state legislators cannot. So.
Just for clarity then, so you're saying that you don't see it as a budgetary need, but it is something that you'll come back to the board and we will work on in terms of defining expectations around one and how we go forward with executing one. Is
I
that
think
correct?
we can probably do it within some existing funds. I have to look and see. I mean, I've conducted a number of those in the state and across the country, and so certainly we can look into see, but I don't think it's going to be a big dollar piece that we have to offset something else in the budget to make it happen.
Ms. Basine?
Just a clarifying question. So if I heard you correctly, the state is requiring an audit of like Perkins or
Right. Federal program monitoring is
Okay,
a requirement of the federal, of all federal grants. that states and school districts receive. So sometimes it's the state's program monitoring that occurs, other times there are districts that are involved in it. It was our turn, and I did leave one off. So our review is for Title I, Title III, which is the ESL, English Language Learner and Support, Special Education, which is Title VI, and VPI Plus, thank you, with the federal Title I piece. And then our Perkins funding, which is funding that supports CTE, our Career and Tech Ed. And so those were the ones on the cycle this year. Mhm. And those are generally compliance reviews versus what I sense the board wants in terms of quality inputs and outcomes.
Yes.
And so that's totally different. So that's what when I said it last week. But I also want to remind the board that process is not is not negotiable. The process has to happen. Can we do it in a way that we improve? We would get some of that through compliance reporting from the federal monitoring, and then what would be the other places we look at?
Now, do you typically use that to determine resource needs?
Certainly, any of the reviews, including the ones that we are doing currently with transportation, finance, and facilities, will come with a set of recommendations. They are recommendations, and as a governance team, as an administrative team, I will recommend to the board which of those recommendations we may want to take on sooner than later, how we're phasing. There may be some that I recommend that may not match for our context. And so, yes, so that will drive it. You always have to look at it through the lens of the review team that comes in, because sometimes folks come in with the experience. They may not have had urban experience. They may not have had large district experience or whatever else, and those pieces will sometimes impact what those recommendations look like. But yes, they will recommend resource needs. Okay? All righty, so I'm checking off my list. So we've done efficiencies and SPED. The facilities piece, again, everyone is correct. We have great needs, even though the board nor the superintendent have asked for $1.4 billion, as has been characterized in the community. We reported on the facility condition of all of our buildings that were 15-plus years old. That's what we did. Certainly, our next step in that, as we've discussed, is taking that document, looking at recommendations we have around the educational planning and what the future may look like for the utilization of some buildings. And then you will recall, we drew the initial 10 schools from there was a plan that goes to 2020. Well, we're at that point now that we have new data to refresh that plan. And that's exactly what we'll be doing, and coming back to the board to say, what are the facilities or what are the needs that we want to recommend to the city for funding in our capital work. We know the 5th PPEA school is under construction. It will still be another year and a half before Camp Allen is completed. Phase 1 will be completed in January, but it'll still be another year and a half before that school is fully ready to be used. And so it is perfect timing for us to talk about what does the future look like in terms of capital needs, major rehab and renovations, major system replacements, or new construction building replacements. So that will be an exercise that we will be undertaking, so that we can see what does that look like. But again, we have not asked for $1.4 billion. We just simply defined our needs, which we are often asked to do. The general maintenance and improvement pieces is that I think we had a pretty robust conversation last week as it relates to what had been $3 million, which is now $2 million, to deal with all of the ongoing maintenance needs. I go back to when we were in this room, probably December, in a joint meeting, and the question was asked, what do you do to maintain this facility? I couldn't have planted a better question. And I didn't, because it came from a council person, that was the perfect question.
because we cannot do it on $2 million a year. The facility report tells us, based on our current real estate, we need about $14 million annually to keep pace based on where the conditions are, what the conditions currently are in our buildings 15 years and older. We know that $14 million annually isn't going to happen. But to the conversation, the last point that Mr. Jordan had in his comments about the revenue sharing formula, we need to get back to the table with some serious conversations. If it's not going to be for the operating budget, we at least need to talk about what the capital needs are, because you remember we shared with the board that our HVAC person had put together a list of buildings and who had chiller and HVAC needs, and this spring and last spring and summer they failed in the order in which he had set that priority. And so those are real needs. You also know we spent about $500,000 of our FY18 money and some other capital projects that had concluded to cover the more than cosmetic work that we did at Booker T. One of the things that we ended up having to do was rebuild each univent in every classroom. Because you recall, I had already shared with the board that the HVAC and the infrastructure system was on its last leg, as the FCI did. I had shared that with the board before, and all of that needs to be redone. And that had a very significant price tag. So we do need to have some more conversations about the facilities as it relates to maintenance and improvement. The grant writer, I hear you, because we have not been successful with a half-time position. We will go back and look and see, you know, what that looks like, and I can report back to the board where we think we can do it, if we think we can accomplish that, or if I may have some other reorganizational opportunities that might get us there, but I'm not there yet.
Ms. Basine.
Have you considered, or is this a position that could be shared with the city, or what is your?
I'm not looking to share this particular position because our unique needs in education,
Right.
we may need professional development linked to teaching and learning, or we could need professional development needed for the support team, or we're looking to support a particular initiative around, and if you're not at the table with the discussions of what our redesign work looks like and what we're trying to accomplish,
Right.
we can still miss opportunities. Let me talk about the technology piece. We actually, again, don't disagree with any comments of what's our current state versus, what our future state should be. And to that end, we're working on some information that we will provide the board soon, probably before or by our next meeting. But one of the things we've been looking at is, what have we been able to do with our technology over the last several years, and what does it look like in terms of the number of devices to student ratio? We've made a great deal of progress through utilizing various grants. Several of the schools that were priority schools and falling under the school improvement grant have purchased iPads or Chromebooks or laptops, the computers as part of that work. We've also, of course, with the Apple Connect program, that opportunity that Berkeley Campostella Early Childhood has, we have the backpack program that was Lake Taylor and Booker T that has provided technology to the table. So we've utilized a lot of different funding opportunities. Our Department of Defense grants have brought technology into those DODEA-supported schools. So we look at every opportunity to bring technology to the table. Where we are, and one of the reasons I said last week that I was not ready to recommend that we're a one-to-one device for all of our students, is that we had to work on our infrastructure. And that's a recommendation that we have in the budget, roughly $840,000, I think, to support our leveraging E-rate. You will recall this year, we were able to do changes in the switches and the work to allow internet reliability, greater reliability of the internet, as well as access to digital content. We've talked about our schools not being able to access WHRO content, public television educational content, because the televisions we have are old, and we didn't have the right pathway, the right bandwidth to allow the digital content to happen. Justice Zamori and working with Karen Bailey and with finance have worked very well to figure out ways that we can do more for less. And so that $840,000 recommendation gets us, so next year we can finish our infrastructure, and then we'll be ready to support more devices in schools. But when you're moving away from just having drops and hard wiring, we still need some of that to support testing, but we don't necessarily need drops and hard wiring for most of the other work. And our wireless infrastructure has to strengthen in order for us to be able to support all of these devices in a meaningful way. So we are working on technology, and so if there was an ask based on the dollars, I would ask that the board support that $840,000. Otherwise, it will delay our being able to move towards some of the technology goals that we share with the board. Any questions on the technology piece? CTE startup. Yes, there's some in what's next to do in the budget that doesn't have a specific dollar amount, but I also need to remind us we are not starting from zero with the CTE high school. We have an existing infrastructure, both at NTC and at Booker T or Lake Taylor, but Booker T, and so we're building from that. Part of what we're able to do that may not require a significant infusion of new dollars, or where we change some courses and bring additional courses on that are part of that pathway to support the comprehensive CTE school. We're not trying to replicate the various labs that we have at NTC, those heavy manufacturing or other labs, because that's where the expense comes in. That's that part of the public-private support, business, Greater Norfolk Corporation, city, and Norfolk Public Schools, that we already have a schematic of a design of a building, though with the change in location would have to be revisited to see how that would navigate within available land. But that schematic talks about then building new labs or enhancing those heavy labs in a new location. So we aren't trying to replicate those labs at NTC, thus the dual campus programming, meaning that students will still be at the high school and spending part of their time at NTC for those labs that are needed there. But the model will begin to shift from a day here to a day there to more of an academic model where you have teams of students, groups of students who are potentially in academics for 2 weeks and in their technical program for 2 weeks. And so that's how we will begin to do that. So a lot of that work that we're focusing on is some of that infrastructure work that at this point does not require a great deal of new dollars. There will be some new dollars that are needed, but we're again leveraging things that we have available to us and partnerships, grants. Ms. Goshen does a phenomenal job of working with our business partners and things that they are bringing to the table to support us in this work. So we are close to having what the operating costs of a comprehensive CTE school would look like, but in terms of startup, because we aren't starting from zero, you don't see lots of new money there, but you will see us use a variety of resources to enhance some of the technology in the programs for the IT Academy, some of which we did this year, to look at perhaps curricular revisions and all of that. That work is underway. So.
I have a specific question about some numbers that are in our budget book on page 158, and it's under the operating budget revenue. Under vocational education, we go from 940,000 roughly, and then over the years, it's changed to where the percent change over 2018 is 477,000. And I'm just trying to understand why this big change, how it affects us. Is vocational education part of CTE?
That is CTE.
Okay.
The terminology, while the budget line items still say vocational education, there's comprehensive career and technical education is the common vernacular for it.
So what does this change then? Because this was a very big percentage change. What exactly does that, how does that impact us at NPS?
I'm going to hopefully not put Ms. Goshen on the spot, but can you help us with the increase in the almost a $500,000 increase that we're anticipating for the FY19 budget in terms of revenue for CTE? I'm thinking that is information that's in the state.
That they're going to be giving to us?
It's a state calculation that the
Okay.
state is increasing. Okay.
So they've, for the CTE?
SOQ for vocational ed.
Okay, so I think we have it, Ms. Goshen. That's purely the state standards of quality, SOQ funding, is almost doubling per student, per pupil amount, and that's where the increase.
So this is actually a good thing then?
That's
for us.
very good.
This is a very good thing.
That's very good.
We don't want to question that.
No, I'm not, I just.
But again,
I-
those are funds available to us to support some of the work that's going on.
Right, I just didn't understand exactly
Great
how
question.
these numbers translated to us, but thank you, that's
Yeah, so we're going from 49 to 74 per pupil.
very good.
Aren't they asking for more requirements for students to graduate in terms of the CTE piece?
Well, we've had requirements for a number of years in terms of sequential electives in the career and tech ed, rather not just taking one course and not finishing or taking a couple of courses. So there's some of that there also that they are looking to support. But again, because we are in a district that had cut back or eliminated CTE at all of our high schools, we're in a place where we're better poised to be successful with those new requirements.
So we will keep the CTE programs that are in the various high schools?
Yes, I've stated that multiple times, even in the presentations. We don't eliminate any of our CTE programs that the 4 high schools that will not host the comprehensive CTE school, but what we will do is continue to enhance and improve those programs and some additional alignment, because not every student is going to want to be in the comprehensive high school. You heard at the retreat, I believe, is when Ms. Goshen commented that even International Baccalaureate is looking at certain CTE programs that will support their program. And so that will be right there at Granby High School. So what are the things we can do to help support their CTE program that will link to the IB? So that's the kind of work we're doing. But we aren't looking to eliminate programs or scale back or reduce programs at any of the other high schools that do not host, that will not host the comprehensive school. All of those remain. But the access to NTC as it currently exists, and eventually the full CTE school, would be through accessing the CTE high school as your choice option for a high school, as the board thinks about what are the choice options that are out there. But every high school will still have CTE programming that doesn't require the level of heavy lab work that we have at NTC.
620 just as
I
No,
have,
not for you, for us collectively. Yes.
all righty. And let me see, CTE startup. Last one deals with the last two, really quickly. The mental health piece, I don't disagree with anything that the board says, and not all put in any pushback on that. But I do think that that's what's needed to support mental health needs in schools goes beyond an individual district trying to accomplish it. It goes beyond a smaller program at CHKD and leveraging those things. We need for the state to step up to support us with mental health issues. When we talk about the discipline piece, yes, students may have acting out behaviors, and there may be a root cause at that, which could be some mental health issues, and what are the system of supports that are needed. One of the questions last week dealt with what would be the cost, I think Ms. Bassine asked, what would be the cost for increasing the number of psychologists and social workers to support mental health needs. We have that figure. If we added, we currently have 23 social workers and 23 psychologists in this proposed budget for next year, and those 46 positions cost us $4.2 million. But it should be noted that we're looking to do contracted services for psychologists because we've had vacancies for the last several years that we have not been able to fill. And so even if we had the money to expand, we may not have the folks that can support us with that fill those vacancies. When this legislature, the General Assembly this year was talking about the discipline shifts and everything else, superintendents were very clear and went on the record, and I even had conversations with a couple of folks in the legislature regarding this, is that the state has to build in a system of supports for us, some financial supports, to help us close some of those gaps. Ms. Wagner is exactly right when she says that some of our therapeutic day providers and some of those mental health supports are linked to Medicaid. If Medicaid dwindles or goes away, we don't have the capacity to backfill that. But those providers work with our Medicaid-eligible students, and we have students who are not Medicaid-eligible who need those supports, and that's why the state has got to partner with us. And then I do agree that there are those community partnerships that we also need to build upon. But the state has got to recognize and accept its responsibility in making this happen for school districts. Communities can't do this alone. So I think, in early planning for next year's legislative agenda, I think that's one we should put on the agenda.
I was just having that same thought. I have.
You need to put a figure, number, and be very detailed about it.
Well, like I said, even if we, it's more complicated than the positions. And so, as I just shared, 46 positions cost $4.2 million.
And a lot of those positions in terms of psychologists and social workers mainly do the triennials and the
They
testing
support
of-
the special education evaluation and review process, exactly. And that's when we've discussed certain situations, and I've shared, we do have crisis teams where psychologists and social workers support schools if things go on, but they really don't have the capacity within their current scheduling to be able to support what we're going. So if we would need 46 more to begin to do something robust within the district to support. And so we're talking about another $4.2 million.
Right. So our schools, social workers, this is just from my limited understanding that, the array of services that they can provide may be wider and they could perhaps be less expensive. Is that true, or
Less expensive
like social
than
worker versus school psychologist?
They do two different roles.
Right, that's what I mean,
Licensed school social worker generally does not do assessments. They may do social, cultural assessments of family dynamics and those as part of the process. But most of our social workers are not LCSWs or licensed clinical social workers where they are providing therapeutic interventions. That would be more expensive than what we currently have. I'm just, on this, I just got one more item, and that was the,
Sometimes still on that particular piece
Since
of-
we were talking about discipline too, so back to the behavioral specialists, are they like, I mean, can you share a little more about them? And-
these are folks that are on site, would be on site, to work directly with students. They are not therapists, but to help schools develop behavioral plans to help implement and monitor those for students that are having such severe behavioral concerns, and probably are not those that are eligible for services under special education, and may not have been identified, may not ever be identified as having a disability, but yet we need to intervene so that they can be successful in school, not disrupt the learning environment, and move that forward. So these are folks that have some behavioral specialization, but not the same behavioral specialization that's used for our students with autism, because those ABAs, they serve a different role in terms of the characteristics of students with autism. Yes, some children on the spectrum have behavioral outbursts or whatever else, but there are many who do not. They have social and other very complex behaviors. And so we're looking to have someone on site, because what we currently have is a punitive model, if you will. So even with the expansion of in-school suspension, and we'll have to resurrect that figure from last year when we talked about what it would take for 44 ISS. Thanks, Dr. Robison. It was $2.4 million last year, so you build in the pay and comp. So it was $2.4 million that we would need to restore ISS at every building. I don't subscribe to the philosophy that suspension, either in school or out of school, is the panacea for student behavior concerns. It's certainly a place to separate students if they violated the code of student conduct and they right now don't have the right to be with their peers. That's what suspension is for. But when we start talking about students with chronic behavior concerns, we have to figure out what are those root causes and be able to provide a system of supports for them. Because suspension, they've already been suspended, and they will walk up to you and say, so you're going to send me home now, right? Yeah. And we aren't changing anything. Suspension in itself does not affect behavioral change. So what do we do to be able to support students? In-school suspension allows us to have a deterrent and not have students out of school and away from the very strong instructional program. But when we have deans, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, we don't have a system of intervention and supports for students. That's not what that part of the model is designed for, which is why I want to look at bringing behavioral program specialists into perhaps a handful of schools that we know, the data show us, and the involvement of the executive directors of schools, the student support services, that we have something going on and we need somebody on site where a teacher can work with, the principal can work with someone, so some direct involvement. It's not a substitute for the teacher, but really how do we get in there and make a difference and put plans in place that we have somebody to help monitor those plans for successful implementation and eventually behavioral changes.
Dr. Robison, do you have something you wanted to?
And that's the model that I was looking at. What I would like to do is, instead of putting kids out on the street or sending them home, is have them in the school so that we can use some interventions to try to change the behavior. Because if they're just out of school, we have no contact with them, we have no ability to influence their behavior. So I support that wholly, and I appreciate your clarifying the difference between the two.
And that's one of the things that, again, in our advocacy with the General Assembly, we said, you know, when you limit the number of suspension days, you forget the impact on the learning environment. And I won't debate anybody over the school-to-prison pipeline. I've spoken on it. You all know where I am in that. And I think we do have a responsibility to not use the court system as discipline for students who have minor infractions and sometimes end up in that world. But I think the general legislature has got to listen to what are impacts when we hear, you know, teachers say, if that child comes back, I'm gone. And yet, when our hands are tied, they have not increased support for elementary alternative programs. They have not provided the support for the mental health needs. And then all of a sudden you say, and by the way, a child can only be out 45 days. That's it for a long term, and that type of thinking. So there's a lot of work that the state needs to do with school districts around this whole piece of work. And just the last comment I have deals with student achievement. Yes, we have some schools that are on the cusp of being fully accredited. We have some schools that have greater lifting to be fully accredited. But everything that we shared with the board at the last retreat in terms of the theory of action, the strategic focus that we have on what it takes to improve learning is what's going on each and every day. While every school is part of the district redesign, the leadership work, the instructional leadership team work, and all of that, schools then have tailored supports based on what that school needs. So we talk about it globally. And yes, we have the state that defines for us the priority schools, the focus schools. They get something else. But we then identify schools that we want to provide additional support for and what that looks like. I'll say the same thing about the reading and math specialists for middle school that I said about in-school suspension. That's only one model of support for students because they provide the professional development support for schools. We've also been doing very targeted professional development around strengthening literacy at both the elementary schools. You all have heard us talk about the guided reading training that we brought in our partnership with HMH Harcourt, our reading group, our basal reading. And so we've been doing that, but there's also been various strategic and specific support for English teachers and other supporting reading at the middle school as it relates to how do we improve writing as part of literacy. And so these specialists, once again, are not the folks who go in and work with students. They provide the supports for the teachers to make sure that they have best practices and understanding of ways in which to adjust teaching, to support learning so that all children can be successful. That work is in our prongs of our redesign work: leadership, literacy, rigor, and innovation. And so when you ask what we're doing for middle schools, we're doing the same thing for middle schools that we're doing for elementary schools and high schools. We're going in and defining targeted support that's needed for success, and it does not look the same across all schools, even though we still are addressing our district-wide literacy needs. So that's what I have. Well, my takeaways.
Excuse me. All right, so we've had some robust discussion, comments from the board, some feedback from Dr. Boone. I think she's identified some additional information that she'll have for us in the coming days. It's 6:35. We want to be able to prepare for the public hearing. Our work is ongoing. We still have to review what we receive, go back and review some of the recommendations that we've had. Our goal again is to be in a position to vote next week. So I'm just going to encourage that as school board members that we have as much conversation with each other as we need to as we prepare for next week. We will have that work session that we had on hold. We will have that available for further discussion. I would ask again if there are additional questions that have come up from today, if you would send those to me so that we can put them together collectively and send those forward to Dr. Boone for consideration. Obviously, she did not intentionally, nor did she have time to go down and try to respond to every single thing that she heard from us, but I think she did a very good job of putting them in buckets: fiscal, non-fiscal, policy, training, and advocacy, and also help us to in some ways, refocus some things that really are on the policy side or our ongoing accountability plan or supporting the MPS redesign work versus seeing it directly tied to this particular budget. So I hope this process was a little helpful. You know, it's the first time for us trying something like this, but we will continue on. Of course, we'll hear from the public, and so I'm sure there'll be some things that we'll hear tonight that can factor into some additional discussions or questions that we have. But all in all, I think it's been a good session. Dr. Boone, something else you want to do?
I do. I concur. I mean, I found value in this conversation and where we are. One data point I forgot to share, there was the question that came up, and one that I have readily available, about the number of long-term subs that we currently have in true vacant positions and how we would use that to balance the budget. Today, we have 50 long-term subs in bona fide vacancies, elementary, middle, and high. So we're looking at reducing 15 positions that, again, will be driven by data, both the school's enrollment as well as the school's needs. Because you recall last year, as we put an equity lens on some things, we had schools that were eligible to lose positions, but we maintained some positions because of the school's needs and the progress and what they were working on. So I did want to let you know we currently have 50 bona fide vacancies that are filled by long-term subs. And those are not maternity or health. Those are bona fide vacancies.
And since I just raised that, really the context of my question was similar to other questions, just understanding the academic impact of what's being proposed as part of that balancing strategy. So it's 6:37. So anybody have anything burning question or comment you have right now? Otherwise, we can begin our transition to prepare for our 7 o'clock public hearing. All right, hearing none, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to an end. If we can be back in our seats, maybe 6:55, and be prepared for the public hearing at that time. We'll have a presentation from Ms. Ingram, and then we'll follow the standard protocol in terms of allowing the public to address. And we'll be here. I think the arrangement may be a little different, but we'll be right here. Yes, we can move. Yes. Thanks. All right.